Okay, we are recording, so we can get started. So our first thing is I'm going to show you an overview. If I can get my screen is lagging here a little bit. It was working 5 minutes ago. There we go. There we go. So an overview of what we're going to be talking about today is the financial reporting at the board level. We're going to touch on some unique aspects of nonprofit accounting, which adds another layer of complexity as a board member looking at financials. Even if you're very versed in for-profit financials, nonprofit financial statements can look very different and feel very different. Then I threw in some Support Kansas City observations related to board reporting. We prepare a lot of management reports each month and each quarter for organizations. So we've heard a lot of feedback from organizations about what works and what does not work. So I wanted to share a couple of those bullet points. And then I wanted to show you an example and then some tools and resources. And if you have any questions or comments, put them in the chat, and Adam and Blake will monitor that. And then since I'm looking at my screen and not the chat, then they will let me know if there's any questions out there. A couple of things to be aware of when you're a board member and you're just starting and you're not really sure about what's going on when they hand you that board packet. I always say, get to know the organization that you're a board member for. Or if you are the staff of an organization, make sure that the board members are educated on how you operate the nonprofit. So what we do at Support Kansas City is when we have a new board member come on, we'll either do it one-on-one or we'll do it in a group. I will walk through our financial statements. So that's probably the first really experience that they have with looking at the financials. I'll answer any of their questions, but that just gives them an introduction to the financial statements and how Support Kansas City operates, because doing presentations like this is a little difficult because I can't do a one-size-fits-all for you, because some of you might have fee-for-service as really your driving revenue, and others of you might have donations or earnings on investments, or everyone is different. So understanding the business model and how you receive money and what you pay out is really important. Another thing to think about is if you're a board member and you're asking questions like, can I see the financials? What does this mean? And you're really not getting the information you need, that could be a cause for concern. Maybe the financials aren't formatted in a way that can lead you to a good discussion, or maybe the staff is not informed, and maybe we all need to sit together and talk through it, because it's not easy to navigate through some of these reports. And then sometimes board members can ask questions that, wow, I've really got to dig through and find this. So if you don't get an immediate response, that's okay. But getting answers to your questions and feeling comfortable about the financial statements is really important. Another one is the organization on the cash or accrual basis of accounting. Well, then we're starting to get into you being having to navigate some of these accounting terms, and knowing cash versus accrual is part of that. Can I get answers to my questions and understanding the business model? So that's when walking through the financials. Do you see accounts payable? Do you see pledges receivable? Okay, those are accrual things, and I'm going to have to understand it in a different way than if it was just, here's what cash we received this month, and here's what cash we paid out the next month. Another question is, when is the year end? that makes a big difference with things too. Are you near the year end? Do you understand what responsibilities there are with year end? That leads into the next question that I always tell board members. You're fiscally responsible as a board member, so you should also know what the filing and reporting requirements of the organization are. And when I say that, I mean things like, if you have an audit, when does that typically happen? Are you making sure that it's getting done? The Form 990 filing, is that filed? Have I seen that? Because sometimes those things, we've had it before organizations, the auditor may have done the Form 990, and then they don't need an audit the next year, and then the 990 doesn't get done. Well, the board, if the board was aware of it, they might have been able to say, wait a minute, isn't this the month that we should be looking at the 990? And it's a team effort to run an organization. So that is a overview of some things to think about as a board member as you start navigating financial statements. So we're going to walk through some slides before we even look at financial numbers to kind of prep you for an overview. It's running super slow today. The next slide is, this is a list of some standard reports that we would typically do for an organization. The statement of financial position, a statement of activity, a statement of activity budget versus actual. And as a board member, I would also ask, is there a budget? Because if there is not a budget, there should be a budget, even if it's kind of a napkin budget that you can see and really gauge, are you reaching your strategic goals against a budget? The cash flow statement, which we'll talk about, is sometimes hard to navigate and understand, but it is a good tool if you can kind of follow how are we spending our cash. And then the next is a net asset roll forward. And that's pretty unique to a nonprofit organization, because what that report tells us is if you have some restricted grants or donors are restricting for certain things, this report will give you a little more detail about what that is for. It is also important at year end, and it's probably one of the more difficult reports to keep up on, because when you have a lot of grants and a lot of restrictions about how to spend the money, tracking that can become difficult. And there's a lot of conversations to have about this between the preparer, Support Kansas City, and then the organization. So if you see some of these reports and they're not, it might say, well, this is a work in progress, or we need to talk more about it. When you're looking at board reports, just think, am I getting enough information to make a sound decision? So if some of these things still need to be tweaked a little bit, that's fine, but are we missing so much information that I do not know what's going on within the organization? So when you're getting reports every month or every board meeting, sometimes they're not going to be as pretty as other times, or 100% complete because they're interim reports. The key is, are you getting information timely enough to make good decisions? So the board should always receive a full set of financial reports, even if they are accompanied by a financial dashboard or other summary. We realize that when in a board meeting, you don't have a lot of time to spend on the financials. So it's great if you have a committee, like I have on the bullet point below, where a committee can look through it and navigate some of the questions and be prepared for board meetings. So tools that can help summarize financial information are great, but in an age of transparency being so important, and organizations need transparency, don't shortcut and try not to give your board a full set of financials. Have that in the board packet for them to refer to. A lot of times in best practice, these reports are typically presented by the treasurer during the board meeting. So the treasurer will meet with the organization. Sometimes the treasurer will meet with Support Kansas City. They will understand it because what they're doing is they're taking it kind of that at that board member level. Can one board member tell the other board members what those reports mean? And so that's really important that a board member, treasurer should be able to navigate through the information and present them. Sometimes in our board meetings, the treasurer will present it. And if there's a deeper level question, then I will come into the conversation and provide deeper context to what the treasurer has presented. So we're going to walk through what each of these reports usually mean before we even look at an example of the report. So the statement of financial position is also known as the balance sheet in the for-profit world. A lot of times, some people will worry about titles. Sometimes we've sent things out and it says balance sheet, sometimes statement of financial position. The important thing is, are the numbers on that statement of financial position or balance sheet correct and timely? So the statement of financial position is only a point in time. It's a position statement. As of this day, here's how much cash we have in the bank. As of this day, here's what our investments are worth. As of this day, this is what fixed assets we have. We have a building. So if tomorrow you sold the building and I presented a financial statement today, it would look completely different. So that's why a lot of times we'll do a statement of financial position and show the prior year so that you can see what changes. So that's where it accumulates everything that's happened over the life of the organization into this point in time. And I have listed different areas that typically you should pay attention to. Cash, of course, that you would have cash. Sometimes you might have 3 or 4 bank accounts on a financial statement. And sometimes those bank accounts are for different purposes. And they may only list the name of the bank. So if there is a purpose for those bank accounts, like, oh, that's the capital campaign account, we only use it for that, or this is our endowment accounts, anything specifically that maybe you could know about that account, ask what that's for. Ask if that is set aside for a purpose. Investments are very much the same way. You might have like a investment account that the board has decided just to set some extra money in that is free to spend how the board wants it. Or your investment account could be an endowment and I can't touch the principal of that account. So there's layers to each of these accounts on this balance sheet. So understanding what they're for is really important. I didn't put fixed assets on here. Fixed assets are things like buildings, things like your office equipment. When you do have a building, that is something to really pay attention to on the balance sheet because buildings take money. You raise all this money to purchase a building, and then it takes money to maintain the building. So really being aware of what assets you have and whether they're going to need to be replaced, or if you have a $2 million building and you don't have like a bank account that you're putting money in to service it, if the air conditioner breaks, how are you prepared for things to deliver and keep that building maintained if you don't have the cash to do it. Oh, every 5 years we have a capital campaign to fund some of the building. Great, now I understand it. So pay attention to fixed assets as well. Liabilities, who do you owe? Many times liabilities for organizations may be strictly around payroll or some benefits or just current amounts that are due for the utilities, or I'm paying a contractor to deliver some services, or maybe you have a loan on the books. So knowing if it's a short-term liability and if you have the assets to cover those, or if it's a long-term liability and that we're comfortable that we will always have a good cash flow to be able to pay those liabilities. And then the last but certainly not least is the section that is the equity section, or the net assets section. Net assets is the nonprofit term for equity. That is an accumulation of information, or it's not cash. It's like all the assets and minus the liabilities. That's your equity in an organization. So again, for the example, if you have a building, your net assets are going to be really large, right? Because it's balancing it out. I have a building over here in the assets, so it's my equity, right? It's my net asset, is my value of that building that we own. So it's important to understand the concept of equity. I'm not going to go too deep into it. We could spend all our time today talking about net assets. But if you don't get the concept, if you still don't understand it, feel free to reach out and ask for some more education about what that means. Because you can have $2 million in equity, but that doesn't mean that you're very liquid and can pay your bills for the next month. So organizations and boards have gotten into trouble by not being able to look at the financial reports and see warning signs. Like the fact that if I have a $3 million building, but my equity is only $2 million, that could be a problem because we don't have enough equity to cover like maybe some of our building needs. Try to go to the next slide. Statement of activity is the income statement in the for-profit world. And this report presents income and expense activity for the current fiscal year or a period in time. So you might see it for the month, you might see it for the year to date. So it is a period of time where this can get confusing too, because it's only a period of time, and some things might have happened in the prior year that are still impacting your activity for this year. But you're only looking at a certain period of time. So as a board member, think about the fact that you're only looking at a certain period of time. Pay attention to the dates. So it will say on the top for the 1 month or for the year to date, so that you know what period of time you're looking for. The revenue, again, it's really important for you to understand the business model of your organization. How are you funded? Are you fee for service, grant revenue, donations, so that you can look at that and know that how you're funded, what a typical year looks like. Are you seasonal? That's probably the most important thing on revenue. Also, if you're grant funded, whether they're typically restricted or unrestricted, are really important as well. Expenditures, typically for a lot of our nonprofit organizations that aren't volunteer led, wages are the largest part of the budget. And there's a lot of time spent around human resources and recording salaries and payroll processing, benefits, all of that, because it takes a lot of people to deliver a mission. So you'll spend a lot of time looking at budget to actual and really kind of managing and asking questions around salaries and benefits. Other expenditures, program expenses. Well, what does that mean? Like a direct program expense would be, I buy paper and it's only for this project that the kids do when they come in and do their summer project, right? It's not for the office. It's what needs to deliver the service, the program that you are running. So typically wages are a big section, direct program expenses are a section, and then operating costs like the rents and the postage and things like that. So we'll see in the example where Support Kansas City, we break our expenditures into some higher level things like the personnel costs, program expenses, and then operating costs, so that we can consolidate them for a board presentation or expand them if you have questions about small line items that make up the expenditures. In the income statements, you can have deeper dive reports. So a lot of times with your board reports, there'll be page after page of income statements or statement of activity. Statement of activity by functional category, statement of activity trending, statement of activity comparative, statement of activity budget. And so you can get really lost in a lot of statement of activities because there's a lot of different ways to slice and dice this income and expense report. I will show you a couple of options at the end here. I'm going to hone in on the budget versus actual, because I did say earlier that a budget is so important as a board member, because if you're not familiar with the organization, how are you supposed to know if you're hitting your targets? So a board approved budget that is put into the financial system is really important in getting that report. And it's also important to understand variances from actual. And we all know that we do our best to figure out what next year is going to look like. And then something like COVID might hit. And we may not approve a second budget or an updated budget. So the key is every time we go through that budget versus actual, can we understand the variances? Oh yes, we were going to hire 3 people, but we didn't because we aren't doing that program anymore. So understanding variances. Some people write to the right of a dollar variance, they put a description about the variance. So the good thing about management reports that we send, those are not for the auditor, they're not for outside view, they're for you internally. To look at. So if you need more information on a management report, narratives, no problem, we can add those. So I always say focus on year to date or an annual budget versus interim periods. Sometimes you can go down a rabbit hole and say, well, why in June was it $3,000 over budget? When if you look at it compared to the annual budget, it's still in line. So be careful about just honing in on what's different than last year, or it's $3,000 off compared to the budget that's showing just for the month. The statement of cash flows. We automatically generate that for the most part from the accounting system. So it shows the change in cash from an accrual basis of accounting activity. So you may have accounts receivable. So if you have accounts receivable, and so that shows up as income on that statement of activity, but you didn't really receive cash. So having a huge accounts receivable is great, but if you're never collecting them, your cash flow is not good. So understanding if you are in a good cash position is very important. And this report, if you can follow it, will kind of show you how cash is being sourced and used. It is hard to understand if you're not from an accounting background. So having someone navigate that it is good. And it presents a change in cash based on your operating activity, your investing activity, and financing activities. This is totally different. Some boards have reports that are cash flow projection reports, which I'm not covering today. But if you are in an organization that is somewhat struggling with cash flow, having additional reports that are projections are important as well. The net asset roll forward. This report presents the change in restricted and unrestricted positions or activity in equity, a detailed breakdown during the year. So it provides detailed unrestricted funds. Who did I get a grant from? How long is the grant? What am I using it for? How much is left on the grant? This is also key in explaining how funds awarded in one year, like the Hall Family Foundation may give you a $300,000 award in this year, but part of the award is that it will be spent for the next 3 years to support a program. Well, we're going to show the whole $300,000 in 1 year as income. And the next year, when we spend the money because we have it, it's not going to show on our statement of activity. But this net asset roll forward would show the Hall Family Foundation has awarded us money and we're spending it over time. So this report can also provide information as to your liquidity outside of restricted cash. So a little more on that later, but you can look at this report and say, oh, we've got so much that is restricted that we can only spend it for salaries, but we can't spend it for rent. Understanding that report is a little difficult sometimes and maybe better in a narrative for the board. The finance committee might look at this and summarize it for the board. Some unique aspects of nonprofit accounting. A lot of times we'll get calls and an organization leadership, they're struggling with trying to explain. I just had an email this week. We're going to use $5,000 of money that we've accumulated over the years, but when we spend it this year, it's going to show a loss on our statement of activity, on our profit and loss, because we spent it this year, but it's not income. So there's really no such thing as a loss in a nonprofit. It's an increase or decrease in your net assets. Funds that you hold, maybe you didn't spend it last year, you're reinvesting that for your mission. So you may have cash in the bank from last year that you're going to spend this year for your mission. So don't think of it as a loss. Think of it as this year we decreased, but last year we had a really big increase. And so what does that mean to the organization as a whole? You don't want a decrease every year, and you don't want your cash to be trending down, but showing a loss is not a word that we use in our nonprofit world. This is a difficult concept because nonprofit accounting is so complex. I think even compared to for-profit accounting, you have all these little nuances of with and without donor restrictions, that you can look like you have a lot of cash in the bank, but in reality, you can't pay for all of your expenses. So Kaufman, if they give us money, they don't want to pay for 100% of Christie's salary. They may want to pay 25%. And they want to pay 25% of maybe a manager's salary. So it looks like we have lots of money in the bank because Kaufman gave us money but we have a year to spend it, and we can only spend it on a portion of salaries. So if we don't raise unrestricted money or a grant that covers the rest of my salary, in reality, I have money in the bank, but I can't spend it on Christy's salary because I've already spent the 25%. So understanding the concept of with and without donor restrictions. And as a board member, you should be asking and you should be able to receive information. You may not have a packet of 40 pages that explains it, but there should be someone that says, yes, we're covered, we are fine. Or if they say, well, I really don't know, ask if you can get information in the future about if you're covering all of your expenses with the inflow of cash that you're getting. Another unique aspect is something that we call functional expense allocation. It's breaking every expense down in administration, fundraising, and program. And if you've ever seen things on Facebook is a great example. Someone will share a meme that United Way or I don't know. There was one rolling around. It was like Red Cross. Red Cross spends 30% on administration. And then some people will say, well, I spend 100% of all of the money received on program expenses. It is a slippery slope because first, you don't want to spend 100% of expenses on direct program expenses, because then you can't pay to have transparent accounting. You can't pay for your fund development. That's not sustainable. So understanding how your buckets are spent, it is great as a board member. Sometimes this doesn't happen till the end of the year with the tax return or with the audit, but it should be something that once a year or on a regular basis, you are able to know what percentage that you're spending in each of these areas. Departments is a term that we would use for this. And you don't want administration to be 50% or 60%, but sometimes it can be 25 to 30%. If you're starting a new program, if fundraising can be high, if you have a capital campaign. So being able to articulate it when asked is more important than trying to shove everything in a program expense and say 100% is going to program. Some support Kansas City observations about board reporting. For board presentations, sometimes less is more. That if you have 16 or 17 page board report, that's great for committees. Sometimes it's not great for board meetings because you can end up spending most of your board meeting talking about those 17 pages. So if you can get some condensed reports, if your information is accurate and it's in a format that is a quick presentation, less can be more. And it can actually answer more questions than if you provided 17 to 20 pages. Be very careful with dashboards and ratios. We all want them. They are fantastic. But what are they really telling the board? And are they pulling the correct numbers? Because if I take my cash position, if I have $500,000 of cash, and I'm trying to give like a current ratio, like how many months of cash do I have in the bank? Well, if that $500,000 of cash includes that Kaufman grant, that's not liquid. I'm not able to use that 500,000. So if I give you a ratio that includes it, I probably haven't given you accurate numbers. So having someone really dive into that dashboard and review the dashboard on a regular basis and making sure the ratios are really telling you operationally how you're doing is so important. we're in the process of redoing our dashboards because things have changed, and we want to make sure. We used to do the same thing. Oh, we've got this much in the bank and it covers how many months of expenses. Well, now we're like, well, let's layer that a little bit. We have this much in the bank, but this much is restricted. This much is available to spend on anything that we need. The most difficult conversation, as I mentioned before, is around showing a negative net income on the statement of activity. It makes everyone stressed out to look at a negative number on the bottom of a report. So understanding if that's a good negative or a bad negative is something that we can help you with. The budget should align with the strategic plan. So you should have a strategic plan. If you don't, that's a good conversation to have as a board. The budget should align with that. And a budget helps kind of contain you to, I know we all have great ideas about what we want to do, but sometimes we can't deliver all of those great ideas, or we wanted to start a new program, but that budget, we went through the budget and we just can't deliver it. A well thought out chart of accounts and reporting will reduce confusion and increase transparency and understanding to the board. A few years ago, we revamped our chart of accounts to make it a little clearer about what we do and how we do it. Just got done revamping an entire set of accounts for a client. They've grown over the years, and we've never gone through and talked about how to make their board reports easier to, their board and their committee reports easier to read. And so this month is the first time that we've rolled out the new chart of accounts, and I think everybody's really happy with it. So it's a great time toward the end of the year or when you're putting together next year's budget to look at the chart of accounts. Spend time with Support Kansas City. If we work with you, spend time with us on the phone call. Board members, we're happy to talk with board members, or we'll educate the staff or volunteer about how to educate a board member on the financial reports. Meeting with new board members to explain the financial reports is a great start. And not being afraid to ask questions. Many times, new board members, you come to the table with great ideas on dashboards and ratios and report formats. And it's really important for us to listen. When we go to board meetings, one thing I ask is, what would you like to see as a board? And they will give feedback, and then we will talk with the leadership of the organization about implementing the ideas to see if that will help with understanding the reports. But be sure these align with your accounting and your strategic plan, and that they are really necessary changes that really provide value, so that you have important, good, solid, transparent information, and it's not a lot of noise when you're looking at the reports. All right, so we're to the sample report. I am going to go through that quickly, and then we can talk through any of the questions that you have on the chat. Here is a sample that I put together kind of based on how our reports look. Our reports are not very fancy. They're pretty straightforward, but the important thing is sometimes we're not concerned about the label at the top. We are more concerned about what do the numbers tell us. So for the most part, if you're a client of Support Kansas City, you will typically see that we'll do a cover page that will maybe put some information on here that have some open items. As a board member, if you see something that doesn't go away that's an open item, it's good to ask about. I threw some numbers in here as examples. As we talked about, being aware of what your checking account is for. helps you say, this is what we have for operations, and comparatives are nice. This is that statement of financial position. Again, a point in time. This is where we were at December 31st. If you see an account on here that, like, what does this mean? A lot of times people will say, what does undeposited funds mean? It's actually funds that we have, but we haven't taken them to the bank. So trying to get it concise and short. I'm going to scroll through these fairly quickly. Payroll tax liabilities. Oh, you might ask, well, why is it 0 this year and not last year? Well, we changed payroll systems and they take the taxes out at the day the payroll is, and last year they didn't. So looking at variances helps you formulate questions. Sometimes in those reports, there are some interesting numbers that are really based on, oh, well, we had to do that for the audit, or we do this at year end. So understanding when numbers change also is important. Here is a the net asset section. As I said, I use this as an example. I made this negative. If we have undesignated or without donor restrictions and it's negative, I would be concerned about that. I don't like to see a negative equity here. That means I'm probably using some donor money for things I shouldn't. And I did change the numbers here. Support Kansas City does not have a negative net asset. But these are things to look at, because I know now that I'm presenting, oh, here's the numbers. This is, to me, it's really hard to digest, because there's a lot of pages and there's a lot of numbers, and you again have a very short amount of time during a board meeting to really address what's in these financial statements. Here's a summary of our statement of activity, an example of what this would look like with a previous year comparison. So this rolls up. I talked about, we revamped our chart of accounts, and things that are in capital, capital letters, they're summary accounts, like fees for service. You'll see we have 4 or 5 sub accounts that make up 725,000, but for board reporting, I can show you very quickly that this is the sum of all our fee for service, or this is the sum of our support income. And then we do the same thing with our personnel expenses, our professional expenses. These are the big bucket items that really drive our income and expense. So this is a really good one to start with if you can consolidate. And then some kind of outliers. If you have a PPP loan, I put a number in here that if you had a PPP loan, it's separate from your operations. So that's an important piece too. So you don't want things that are kind of anomalies or kind of in here with the rest of the kind of ongoing organizational, operational activities. Again, more examples. This is a budget performance example I put together kind of based on the way we're set up. Again, if it's in all caps, it's a header and then all the detail below it. And when we do a budget, we're doing our budget by detail line item. So this is the report where you would say, well, why haven't we met our budget for the year or for the period in accounting services? And then that would be a question. Why haven't we? And then leadership could come back and explain some of these variances to you as a board member. We do some interesting things. Again, every report is unique to your organization. We do some interesting things around our grant support, that we only show what we use unrestricted funds as revenue. So We do that so you can really truly see how the organization's doing. Again, this would be a whole other conversation or a one-on-one conversation if you would like to talk about, how do we show how we're doing if we receive $300,000 from Hall Family Foundation and we have to use it over 3 years. So this can be a long report when you have all the detail. Like I said, in a meeting, you may not have a lot of time to address this. So knowing summaries and having the treasurer present is key. Here's the statement of cash flows. Again, it can be a little daunting. This is like your net income, but net income doesn't mean cash in the door. It goes through a calculation of, well, that added to our cash or that decreased our cash. And the bottom shows the net increase of cash. So look, even though we made $651,000, our change in cash was only 46. And I ran through these reports very quickly. So if you think about the time that you give to your financial reports during board meeting, and you're all giving of your time and your energies and your expertise, having this condensed or a narrative to go along with it really helps the board meeting move along. And having a finance committee also helps that board meeting move along because you can one-on-one with the finance committee. The finance committee can work with leadership. The finance committee can work with Support Kansas City. But I know we're not all that lucky. So we're always here to answer questions. I'm going to show you one last report. This is the format we use. I mock this up for what we use. If we get grants, you can see that if Kemper gave us money to for our diversity and inclusion project that we're working on, they may have given it to us in 2020, but we're not going to spend it till 2021, but we're going to track our spending. This can change. Sometimes we'll put this report together and the next month we might find out that, we could have used $96,000 of this, right? I'm going to allocate some of Christy's salaries from August. So this is kind of a fluid report, but it gives you an idea that, wow, I've got $281,000 worth of funders' money that I haven't spent yet. Or maybe Kansas Health Foundation still owes us $100,000. So of that 281, that's not all cash. So it leads into deeper discussions. This might be, we don't present this at our board meeting anymore. We do present this to the finance committee. So having things summarized, again, so important for your time as a board to be able to review the financial statements.